and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share a collection of stories from people who encountered cryptids they were unable to identify. Two of these stories feature people who think they encountered lesser-known cryptids. So it's time to once again put on our detective hats as we delve into these encounters and see if we can identify what these posters came across. Alright, on to the first story. The first story of this episode comes from a poster who doesn't say where he's from, but that he lived in an urban neighborhood when his strange encounter took place. Although urban, one road at the back of his neighborhood was lined with very dense forest. The forest covered approximately a mile going away from the original poster's neighborhood. He and his father would always take late night walks due to his father's insomnia because of his late work shift. They thought nothing about walking in the late hours because their neighborhood was very safe. The OP fondly remembers the walks he and his father took and considers them very dear memories, all except for one, which would, unfortunately, be their last. On that fateful night, they were walking along the neighborhood's back road near the forest. They often walked this path because they enjoyed listening to the normal sounds of the forest. The road had a lone streetlight that lit only a small portion of land the owners had let go and was overgrown. This was across the street from the forest. The night was normal and their walk was just like any other until his father abruptly stopped and pulled him close. He put his hand over his mouth to keep him quiet and they crouched down. He then pointed to the patch of overgrown land that was lit by the lone streetlight about 100 yards from their current location. The OP didn't see anything at first and thought maybe his father was playing a joke on him, but just as he started to try and move himself away from his father's grasp, he saw a humanoid figure emerge from the brush. It was small in stature and he estimates approximately 3 feet tall. It was scrawny and had long arms and legs. It was cautious as it came out of the overgrown vegetation, inspecting its surroundings, before turning and signaling from where it had appeared. 2 more figures that looked like the first joined it, and the 3 of them had what looked to be a conversation before bolting across the road and heading into the tree line. The OP's father instantly sprung into action, grabbing his son and throwing him over his shoulder before taking off back toward the house. The OP says his father was 6'5" and 220 pounds, and he was 120 pounds at the time of the event. His father did not slow down and showed no signs of fatigue as he was running, carrying his son. The OP chalks this up to fear and adrenaline. That would be their last late night walk. His father installed 4 very bright motion detection lights around the acre of land that they lived on and got a dog shortly thereafter. The OP tried to talk to his father about the incident a few times, but his father will not talk about it. He made it very clear he did not ever want to discuss what happened that night. The thought of those 3 small humanoid figures still gives the OP chills to this day, and he vividly remembers them standing there huddled together. I've heard only a few stories about small humanoid beings as described here. I was glad to find a story about them that hasn't been covered, at least to my knowledge, because I'd love to be able to do more stories about lesser known cryptids. And this is one of them. I'll be the first to admit that I don't know much about them or even what they're called. If you have any knowledge of these small humanoid beings, please pass them along in the comments. Also, if you have any or see any stories about obscure cryptids like these or any other and would like for me to tell them on this channel, please send them to me. You can email them to wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. What do you think those small humanoid figures were that the OP and his father saw that night? The next story was posted by a father telling his son's story. At the time of the encounter, they lived in New Mexico, but he does not give an exact location. His son was 17 years old when he saw something on the road that still scares him to this day. It was Friday night, and being teenagers, his son and 2 friends wanted to be anywhere but at home on the weekend. The original poster's son was driving with his friends. They were heading to one of the friends' homes who lives out in the country. The road they needed to take to get to his house was completely isolated and surrounded by desert, with the land in that area completely flat and mostly dirt. The OP's son slowed down, expecting the man to move, but he didn't. He just stood there, so the son stopped his truck. At this point, the man was standing just outside of the truck's headlights. The boys couldn't see his face, but they could tell he was facing them. He was wearing jeans and a long-sleeve t-shirt. They sat frozen, watching the man in the road before trying to decide if they should go around him or just back up and go back the way they came. Before they could decide how to handle the situation, the man suddenly dropped down on all fours and started running toward the truck. The boys screamed and the OP's son threw the truck in reverse and gunned it. They were traveling backward down a dark country road with the man chasing them on all fours, and he was somehow keeping up with the truck. His son sped up to a speed faster than what they were already going, and finally they left the chasing man behind. When they lost the mysterious stranger, they turned the truck around and went back home. The OP was in the living room when the boys came bursting through the front door, slamming it behind them, locking it, and running up to his son's room. He went to see what happened, and that's when they told him what they encountered on the road. He says he has never seen them so pale or so afraid, and that they were completely freaked out. For 3 boys who wanted to be anywhere but home on the weekends, they did not leave the OP's house for the entire weekend and only left because they had to attend school on Monday. Over the next month, they would only go out during the day, but at night they would stay home, usually at his house. Finally, after about a month, the boys started going out again. The 3 of them did some research and they all think that they saw a skinwalker. Even now, if the OP brings up that night, his son and friends get very quiet and look afraid. They believe it will come back if they talk about it. I believe they might be right in that they saw a skinwalker that night. The location of New Mexico certainly fits. But this is the first story I've heard where, if this is a skinwalker, it ran at high speeds in human form, and on all fours. That would be beyond creepy to see, and I can understand why the boys didn't want to go out at night for a while. I've also heard in stories that talking about skinwalkers can attract them. If they've done enough research, then they know this too, and that's probably why they won't talk about it. What do you think they saw that night? The next story takes place in Ontario, Canada. The original poster does not give an exact location. The OP was out one night with some friends. It was around 12 a.m. and they lived in a very rural town. He has witnessed multiple UFO sightings, but what he saw on this night was different and left quite an impression on him. In fact, he says, like many people who encounter a cryptid, that he will never forget the events that transpired on that night. He and his group of friends usually hung out late at night at a place he refers to as the Pit and at a local baseball field. It was not out of the ordinary for them to be out there past midnight, including just about every night during the summer. They were usually the only ones out that late in their small town, but on this particular night they were not alone. He and his friends were hanging out at the aforementioned baseball field, but they saw some faint blue lights and everyone started to freak out, so they all disbanded. The OP and his one friend headed over to the Pit. Near the Pit was a cemetery. It was when they were walking past the cemetery that they saw what they referred to as the White Lady. Out of the pitch black forest emerged a tall, lanky, humanoid figure that looked to be coming from the cemetery. It looked like it was covered in all white and appeared as if it didn't have any clothes on. The way it was walking was incredibly strange, and it made the boys flee in fear from this being. They had already been on edge because something just felt off prior to the encounter. Even now, when they mention it to each other, it still freaks them out. No one else ever saw the White Lady, and they still don't know what it could have been. But, as usual, I have some guesses about that. I'm not sure how they came up with the name White Lady. He doesn't explain that one. I'm thinking this was either a crawler or a wendigo. The description matches both, being tall, lanky, and having pale skin. It could also have very well been a person, but when someone describes another being as looking humanoid in appearance, it's because whatever they are seeing, while resembling a human, is not human. Being that he has seen UFOs in the area, perhaps he caught sight of an alien. Also, based on how they say it was walking very peculiar, I can't fully rule out a spirit or a demon either. However, my guess is either a crawler or Wendigo. What do you think they saw? The next story comes to us from a poster who does not say where his encounter took place. He grew up in the mountains and his parents owned a lot of horses. They would do guided pack trips out into the mountains. The original poster's job was to go out each morning and wrangle the horses. They let them graze in the evenings. The horses wore cowbells to make them easier to find, and sometimes the OP would find them hours away from camp. One morning in particular, the horses had wandered a good distance away and the OP was having trouble locating them. His search took him into an area where the forest was old and very dense. It was about this time that he grew frustrated from not being able to find them and did not want to return to camp without them. Then, in the distance, he heard the bells. Rejuvenated, he hurried in the direction from where the bells came from and found himself on the bank of a winding creek. The bells stopped. Moments later, the bells sounded in a completely different direction. The OP started off in this new direction, wondering if the water had carried the sound of the bells, making them sound as if they were coming from a different direction than they actually were. But this continued to happen. He would follow the sound of the bells to a different edge of the creek, deeper into the forest each time before they stopped and sounded in a different direction. After about the fourth time, he listened to his gut and he got out of there. What disturbed him the most was when he got back to camp, he found all the horses there and all of them were accounted for. They had found their own way back. It was a rare occurrence, but there they all were, not one missing. The Aboriginal trail hands told him that they thought it was a mischievous spirit trying to lure him into the forest until he was hopelessly lost. This one has me stumped. My first thought when reading this story was maybe a Wendigo, but the mention of Aboriginal trail hands at the end of the story makes me believe that the events of this incident took place in Australia. I haven't heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, any Wendigo encounters coming from Australia. They seem to be a North American cryptid due to its ties to the Algonquin Native American tribe. Perhaps it could have been a spirit, or a demon, or something else entirely. I will say though that whatever was trying to lure him deeper into the forest did not seem mischievous to me. At least that's the feeling I got when reading this story. Whatever it was, and usually when something tries to lure you deep into the forest like that, it usually has malicious intent. What do you think was trying to lure the OP into the forest? And what intent do you think it had for him? The next story comes from a poster who tells about an experience he had when he was about 13 years old. He doesn't say where his encounter took place. The original poster and 4 of his friends would always go out camping in the woods near his friend's house. Their encounter would take place one weekend while they were out camping in those very same woods. They had discovered the 2-pack of flares sold at Walmart and would buy them to burn stuff for fun and mess around with them as teenage boys would do. The OP had an old machete that his friend wanted to heat up with the flares and hit with a hammer to see if he could reshape the blade. The OP didn't care, so his friend got to work with everyone standing around watching him. That's when the OP heard a noise close to them in the trees. He looked over and saw something walking in the shadows, and about 7 to 8 feet in the air he saw an eye that looked red, but that could have just been the reflection from the light of the flare. He got his friend's attention, but they didn't see anything and were confused at first. But then the tree right behind one of his friends shook. This terrified the group, and one of his friends, who lived about 5 minutes away, decided to call his mother to come pick him up. 2 of the other boys decided to go with him. The OP reflects that this was the smartest decision any of them could have made at the time. He, however, stayed behind with one of his friends and decided to try and stick it out for the night after the other 3 left. The two boys were sitting in the tent when they heard something near the camp outside. The OP and his friend just knew it was their other friends coming back to mess with them. Just about the time they voiced this, a finger pokes into the side of the tent, making a noticeable indentation. Whatever is doing this then drags its finger down the side of the tent toward the front. Still convinced it was his friend, he called him and asked where he was. His friend told him he was at home and the OP was about to call BS when he heard his little brother in the background. They didn't encounter anything the rest of the night and never saw anything out there again. But the OP says that what they experienced that night was the most terrifying experience he's had in his life. This to me sounds like Sasquatch behavior, especially the shaking of the tree and the dragging of the finger down the side of the tent. The eye being about 7 to 8 feet in the air, which would put this creature's height at about 8 to 9 feet, also matches. What do you think came to visit the boys at their camp that night? The final story of this episode also involves another obscure cryptid, this one being called the Grindylow. Grindylow are human-like creatures with extended arms and long fingers. They are said to live in marshes and steep pools and, as legend puts it, devour children that have come to play too close to the water. As soon as an unattended child gets near the edge of the water, the Grindylow is said to grab them and drag them in. The creatures date back to folklore that originated in the English countries of Yorkshire and Lancashire. The name is thought to be connected to Grendel, a name most famously used in Beowulf, but also found in many Old English charters, where it is seen in connection with meres, bogs, and lakes. In these legends, Grindylow are said to grab little children with their long sinewy arms and drown them if they come too close to the water's edge. They have been seen as a type of boogeyman used as a ploy to frighten children away from pools, marshes, or ponds where they could drown. If the name sounds familiar, it could be because a depiction of the creature was used in the Harry Potter books and films that was based on the legend. The person who posted this story was about 5 or 6 when it took place. He was at a park in Milwaukee, Wisconsin that had a pond. Fascinated by the water bugs, fish, algae, and just about everything else in the water, the OP was squatting down at the water's edge when something green shot out of the water and grabbed his shoe. It started pulling and his foot slid out from under him and into the water. He fell backward and whatever had a hold of him let go and was gone in an instant with a small splash. He got up and ran to his mother, shouting that something had grabbed him and tried to pull him into the water. His mother consoled him and told him he probably just slipped, but he says he knows the truth. He ends his post with a warning to the people who live in Milwaukee, saying there is a Grindylow in the pond in Cozy Park. One commenter said the same thing happened to them, but on the Brandywine River in Delaware. They were sitting on a dock along the river when something reached up, grabbed their foot, and pulled them into the river. When it yanked them off the dock, it did so hard enough that the commenters scratched their leg on the wood. Their parents quickly grabbed them and pulled them out of the water and chalked it up to them just falling in. No one believed them when they said that they were pulled into the river. Neither the original poster nor the commenter saw exactly what grabbed them and pulled them into the water, but they both believe it was a Grindylow. Based on the description of this lesser-known cryptid, it certainly fits with this behavior. Luckily, neither succeeded and both escaped their encounters. I said this before at the end of the first story, but if you have or find a story about an obscure or mostly unknown cryptid and would like for me to tell it on this channel, email me. I'd love to be able to share stories about lesser-known cryptids. As for these stories, what do you think tried to pull them into the water? Could it have been a Grindylow, or was it something else? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.